winding our way through the 60s and 70s with Nixon. Can't talk about the 60s and 70s without President Nixon. All right, so review question to start us off. What was NOW? An organization created by Betty Friedan. Remember this from the Civil Rights Movement's unit. Was it A, the National Organization of Writers, B, the National Organization of Workers, C, the National Organization for Water, or D, the National Organization of or for Women? All right, so Richard Milhous Nixon, our 37th president. Background on him, self-made man. He was born pretty poor. His father failed at ranching and then owned a vegetable store. That was always, a couple of missed payments away from going bankrupt. He went to Whittier College, then Duke for law school. Then he served in the Navy during World War II, and he received 2 medals for his service. He will come home, become a lawyer, before running for Congress and winning election in 1946. 1950, he becomes a senator from California. 52, he became the vice president for Eisenhower, so he was vice president for 8 years. Then he runs for president, and he loses to JFK. Goes home to California, runs again for governor there, and loses. And everyone thought at that point that he was done. They said Nixon's career as a politician is over. He can't win any big elections. Then somehow in 68, he comes back. He wins the Republican nomination and eventually becomes president after beating Hubert Humphrey in a fairly close election. 68 will be a crazy year. Okay, the year that Nixon becomes president will be one of the craziest years in American history. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. right there in the middle. He gets assassinated in 68. Riots ensue throughout much of the country. Then Bobby Kennedy on the left there, he dies. He gets assassinated while he's running for president as a Democrat. On the far right, you get George Wallace, who runs probably the most racist campaign in all of American history. He starts his own party, and he only wins southern states, or a few southern states, I should say. He basically ran on a platform of bringing back segregation everywhere. In fact, he famously said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he will win a few states in a presidential election of 68. It was a pretty insane year, and that doesn't even talk about how crazy the Democratic National Convention was. So basically, real quick, what happens is Lyndon Johnson was president. He was a Democrat. Everyone thought he'd run for re-election, so nobody really campaigned. A couple of people tried to primary him, but they thought he'd stay in. He decides kind of abruptly to drop out of the race. When he does so, all hell kind of breaks loose. A lot of people start running. Bobby Kennedy starts making a run. A few others do. What they eventually do is just give all of the electors, right, or all the delegates that were supposed to go to LBJ when they thought he was running, they gave them to Hubert Humphrey, and people lost it because Humphrey didn't campaign. He really didn't campaign for this at all. It was just going to take the nomination at the convention. It was basically just the bigwigs of the party deciding who was going to run and all this stuff. There was a lot of protests, a lot of people freaking out. So what does Chicago do? Because this was in Chicago, the mayor orders the police basically just to beat the crap out of everybody. So you'll get thousands of people beaten by the police, thousands of protesters. It turns into just a complete and utter clown show. So the Democrats weren't in a great place, which made it a lot easier for Nixon to win. So before winning in 1968, becoming president in 68, Nixon lost 2 very high-profile elections. What were they? Was it A, the 1960 presidential election, B, the 1962 congressional race in California, C, the 1963 governor's race in California, or D, the 1964 Senate race in California? So obviously 2 of those are correct. Here's the presidential map that he won. Okay, he will win the Electoral College pretty handily, 301 to 191. But a lot of these states were real close to going one way or the other. He will win the popular vote. Actually, let me look on here, squinting. He barely loses the popular vote. He gets 42.8%. Humphrey got 43.2%, so just 0.4 difference there. But you can see there 13%, 9.5 million people, mainly in the Deep South, will vote for the American Independent Party and George Wallace's racism. But there you go. Oh, okay, so Nixon does win the popular vote. I got this scrambled. The numbers are, or the colors are different. So traditionally blue means Democrat and red means Republican, but on this map that's flipped. So Nixon will barely win the popular vote, and he will win the electoral vote. There we go. All right, so foreign policies. He had some big successes in foreign policy that'll make him more popular. He's going to win re-election pretty handily outside of all of the corruption stuff. So he will officially be the ender of the Vietnam War. Now, he should get zero credit for this, but he got some credit at home for being the guy that said, well, the war is over. Of course, he was doing all sorts of disgusting things, lying to the public about what he was doing, including bombing 2 innocent countries and killing thousands and thousands of innocent people in those countries of Laos and Cambodia. But the fact that he is the guy that officially ends the war and removes troops, he got some credit for that. Some things that are actually positive here. He normalized relations with China. So we recognize the People's Republic of China as a country in 1972, and we begin trading with them. That was a big deal. He holds a meeting with Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev was at this point the premier of the Soviet Union, which will lead to a strategic arms limitation treaty. We call it the SALT Treaty, so it's going to limit what kind of weapons are created, which is positive. They push the détente, which is friendly relations between the communist powers of Russia and Soviet Union and China, to have a better relationship with them. So the U.S. and those two countries will get along a little bit better. He followed all this through what they called realpolitik. Him and his top advisor, Henry Kissinger, was the idea that the United States should make alliances based on national interest, not necessarily on agreeing with other nations' worldview. So that's how we can go from being complete enemies with China to being, let's get along, right? Because it's in our best interest. We don't have to necessarily believe everything you believe. We won't have the same level of normalized relations with the Soviets. That'll never come. But with Russia, we have pretty normalized relations now after the Soviet Union fell apart. So on the left, there is Nixon shaking hands with Mao, the guy who led the communist revolution in China, right? Who was public enemy number one for a lot of Americans for a very long time. On the right, there he is shaking hands with Brezhnev, the premier of and leader of the Soviet Union. So which of these countries did Henry Kissinger and Nixon open up for trade during the Nixon administration? Was it A, Brazil, B, China, C, Cuba, or D, the Soviet Union? Back-to-back questions. The easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union was called what? A, détente, B, counterculture, C, glasnost, or D, napalm? All right, domestic policies. Believed in the idea of new federalism. Okay, new federalism. So this was what he called his idea. So it started with revenue sharing between the federal government and states. Thought that there should be a minimum income for poor families and payments controlled by the states. He will not push this idea. We'll talk a little bit more about the family assistance plan here in a second. Overall, Nixon's policies are mostly quite conservative, but he will try to outflank the more liberal party, the Democratic Party, with some economic ideas, which is kind of something that comes up now and then. Trump has proposed some ideas that kind of outflank to the left of the Democratic Party. None of those have come to fruition, but he's proposed some of them, and Nixon will be kind of similar in that regard. The energy crisis hits during Nixon's presidency, and this is not particularly his fault, but it's something that happens, and we blame presidents when bad things happen. So, a group called OPEC is formed. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So basically, it's all the Middle Eastern countries, plus Venezuela, that produced most of the world's oil at this point. They get together, they form this group so they can have more political power in the world. If they control the oil supply, which is at that point probably the #1 commodity in the world, then they can force people to do things, right? Big part of this is they wanted to force the United States into recognizing Palestine, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, right, which is very much against what America wants to do at this point, especially because we're supporting Israel, right? So what they will do is impose an embargo on the United States. They're going to stop shipping as much oil to us to try to force us into doing this. The cost of oil triples in the United States. Gas prices, so at the pump, it'll double. Okay, gas shortages occur where they run out of fuel. So people are lined up for miles in their cars waiting to get to the gas station to get fuel, and they run out of fuel. Inflation. Just the standard inflation in our economy goes above 10%, which is bad, right? Which is bad, especially in our context. For America, it's really bad. Civil rights. Nixon was awful on civil rights. He was awful on civil rights. Will very thinly veil his racism through things like his Law and Order platform, which was basically saying things like, we're going to make sure that those scary black and brown people get arrested, but he'd veil it in a way, and we'll talk about the Southern strategy here later. He will start the war on drugs officially, right? He officially declares a war on drugs. He didn't fund it as much, especially as, say, we'll get to Reagan, but the war on drugs was an entirely insane, crazy, huge waste of money and failure. We will start incarcerating people at alarming rates for drug use or drug selling, and it hasn't at all lowered the amount of drug use or drug selling in America. Even worse than all of that, it's done in a pretty racially skewed manner. And if you just look at the raw numbers, it's pretty bad. The rate of incarceration for minorities over drug crimes will explode. Even though we know that white people and black people and brown people all use drugs at literally almost exactly the same rate. We know that people buy drugs from people that are close to them and look like them. So we know there's a lot of white drug dealers. But for some reason, black and brown people get arrested much more. And I'll give you one more example about how this was done in a more racially charged manner. The difference between powder and crack cocaine. So if you got caught with crack cocaine, it was an automatic jail sentence, automatic federal jail sentence. If you got caught with powdered cocaine, it wasn't. White people use powdered cocaine. Traditionally, black and brown people use crack cocaine. So it was a huge failure, right? A huge, huge failure. But it's not just a Nixon failure, because Carter's going to continue it. Reagan's going to put it on steroids. Bush is going to continue it. Clinton's going to put it on steroids. Bush is going to continue it. Obama will in some ways continue, in some ways go down from it. Now Trump's trying to bring it back a little bit more too. So it's been a pretty bipartisan failure. Anyways, back to civil rights and Nixon. He was sought to block reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. He didn't want the Voting Rights Act to continue. We needed the Voting Rights Act to make sure that black and brown people actually got to vote, and he wanted to get rid of that. He also wanted to stop school desegregation. However, he will help further affirmative action policies by creating timetables to get it in place. He thought if he get it in place, he'd get it ended sooner. So that's why he did it. It wasn't out of any particular affinity for black and brown people. So anyways, here's OPEC. Right? OPEC expanded off of what it was originally, but a lot of countries in the Middle East, and then a few countries in Africa that produce oil, and then Venezuela is the big one in South America, but Ecuador is in there too. So what happened to gas prices in America when OPEC proclaimed an oil embargo? Prices rose from $3 a gallon to $10 a gallon. Prices dropped from $8 to $4 a gallon. Or C, all prices stayed the same. All right, domestic policies under Nixon. Social Security benefits and food stamps will increase. During his presidency, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, was created. And they were both created, and those things happened all over Nixon because he didn't want them to happen. He didn't support them. He didn't campaign on them. He didn't want that stuff to happen, but it happened anyways because the Congress and the Senate passed it over his head. He did embrace the Family Assistance, or the FAP program, the FAP program there, briefly. It was originally proposed by LBJ. Nixon will adopt it temporarily. Basically, it was cash payments to poor and working class families, sort of like a universal basic income, like Yang talked about this year in the presidential campaign. Nixon wanted to use it to eventually do away with welfare, which is also kind of how Yang wanted to use it. And it was super effective, literally, in this country. We've done this a few times. We've tested this a few times, just giving money, no strings attached, to poor people, to working class people, to homeless people. And it works. It's actually cheaper than arresting people and putting them through the process and then releasing them and then re-arresting them a bunch of times. People are generally, especially poor people, are generally good with their money because they have so little of it. They know how to stretch that money. So it was pretty effective. In fact, it was really effective, but it's not politically popular, especially Nixon being a conservative. It's not popular to give money to poor, I should say, especially homeless people. So it gets done away with. There have been other experiments with this in London recently. They started just giving money to a small group of homeless people, and 90% of them ended up not being homeless anymore, and stabilizing their lives. In Utah, where I grew up, Utah hasn't voted for a Democrat since 1964. So under Republican leadership, they started this program called the 5,000 Doors program, where the state built 5,000 low-income housing units and put homeless people there, and it was a raging success. Until people got jealous that homeless people were getting things, so they had to do away with it. Kind of similar to this Nixon policy. Anyways, environmental legacy. The EPA gets created in 1970 under Nixon. This doesn't mean that Nixon cared about the environment. He thought that if he put a bureaucracy behind the environmental movement, he could stunt it. And sometimes that happens. Like right now, we're in a pandemic. There's a big disease going around. So what does the Trump administration announce? They announce that the EPA is not going to do anything. They're not going to protect the environment at all right now. So at times, Nixon's idea happens. The EPA, though, in general terms, throughout most of American history until like 2 weeks ago, the EPA would and continues to stand at the forefront of environmental protection. Nixon and Ford will oppose it on conservative grounds that it will hinder the economy. That's always the big question, right? If we have any environmental protections, then we're going to destroy the economy, which just isn't really true. Okay? Things are never that black and white. Toxic waste was dumped at horrific levels back then. The EPA and eventually President Carter started designating things called Superfund sites to reduce waste. Part of the reason, and a side note on here, part of the reason we had to pass the EPA is that the Cleveland River started on fire multiple times. A river, okay? A river started on fire. So it was probably a good idea to, I don't know, protect it a little bit, okay? I should change this, I guess it's technically called the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, started on fire multiple times. Anyways, nuclear power. Okay, we started developing nuclear power at a couple of nuclear power plants, and there will be not a full meltdown, a partial meltdown at the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility in Pennsylvania. What happened was they had these beads, right, and these beads were made of certain chemicals, and these beads roll in and they help the process work, right? So how a nuclear power plant works is it produces nuclear power. They pour water into it. That water immediately, because it's so hot in this nuclear reaction, becomes steam. That steam gets funneled through some pipes to a turbine. It spins the turbine. That turbine creates electricity, and we store that electricity. Part of the process at the 3 Mile Island plant was to pour in these beads. That's not like a person was pouring them in, but the machine pours in these beads. Those beads got stuck. They jammed up the machinery, and instead of to avert a complete meltdown, right? Like we'll talk about later with Chernobyl in the Soviet Union, to stop that from happening, they released a bunch of radioactive gas just into the air to avert that. And that was basically, this will be the end of large-scale nuclear power in America because we got so freaked out that had to happen. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 gets passed and signed by Nixon. It'll help save the bald eagle and bring it back from extinction. That was sort of the animal that was used as a mascot for this. It's controversial sometimes, I guess. Some people think it's government overreach. That's taking too much land and putting it aside to protect animals when we could develop it for other things. I don't know how much of a concern that really is. Anyways, here is Nixon signing laws into place. Perhaps OSHA, which protects you and regulates work environments to make sure that you are safe at work, and the EPA to protect the environment. So true or false, Nixon supported the environmental safety and welfare programs that were passed during his presidency. Is that true or is that false? All right, the economy. The economy under Nixon was not great. It's not all Nixon's fault. One thing I'd like to point out is that presidents don't control the economy. We give them too much blame. We also give them way too much credit about the economy. But I guess that's part of the job. So during Nixon's presidency, he will cut spending and he will raise taxes to try to balance out the budget a little bit. 1971, he will institute a wage and spending freeze in the federal government. It's the first time the president had the power to do this, and every single president since him has done so. They always do at the beginning to say they're going to reorganize things, and they don't really reorganize things that much, and spending goes back up. Unemployment goes up, and inflation goes up in America during this time period. Why did it happen? Well, way more competition from foreign countries like Germany and Japan, who had fully rebuilt by this point from World War II. A large deficit from the Great Society program in the Vietnam War. We spent a lot of money on those LBJ plans, and we spent a lot more money on Vietnam, right? You combine those things, we have a large federal deficit. Energy costs go up with the founding of OPEC and the oil embargo. And the U.S. begins shifting away from manufacturing to service-based industries. Okay, so America is not the world's manufacturing power anymore. A lot of stuff's made, say, in China. Places like that, or Vietnam, or South America, places that don't have the same labor laws that we do, that don't have the same environmental protections that we do, so therefore it's a lot cheaper to build things over there. So the general argument is that we should lower our standards, I guess. I don't think that's necessarily the right tact. We're supposed to be a world leader. We should put some sort of penalties in place for countries that don't guarantee the same stuff we do. That's the way to make them act better. But we shift away from building things as much as we shift towards the service-based economy, like restaurants, right? Is a big service industry. Customer service, retail, tons and tons of retail here in America. So we shift away, right? That's a big thing, right? That's still something that we are dealing with. I mean, say right now, during the COVID crisis, right? How many service jobs are deemed necessary? How many people still have employment in those service jobs? That's something we have to reevaluate. Anyways, other stuff, we increase our military and social spending without raising taxes. Nixon will raise some taxes. Stagflation happens, which means that the economy grows very slowly, it's stagnant, and we have high inflation. This happens across 4 presidencies, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and the first term of Reagan. Unemployment goes up to 9%, which is double. Well, I have to look at our numbers now with the COVID crisis. We were just under 4% before this happened, so it's double where we were at before. Inflation at 11%. I think our inflation is like 2% right now, 3%, so it's much more then than it is now. Couple of Time magazine covers Nixon's economic gamble. Nixon's other crisis is right there. It looks like how bad our money looks. All right, the election of 1972. So Nixon runs for re-election. His vice president was a guy by the name of Spiro Agnew, which is the weirdest name of any vice president maybe ever. Runs against George McGovern and some guy named Shriver. You never ever need to know who Shriver is. And they run against another third party. George Wallace runs again, okay, with Curtis LeMay, who was a former military guy. On the American Independent, in parentheses, should be their much more racist party. So McGovern will win the Democratic nomination, but he gets very little support from the party. He campaigned on a super dovish platform. If he got elected, he said all troops move or get out the next day. Right? He get out the very next day. Nixon meddled in Democratic politics. Okay? Nixon was very, very, very paranoid, and he was also very, very corrupt in the way that he handled things. He wanted to make sure that he won all the time, and so he would use the government to aid himself, which is super bad, super bad, super gross. So one example of that, there was a guy named Ed Muskie running for the Democratic presidential nomination, and Nixon drove this guy crazy. He had spies working in the Muskie campaign that would tell him what Muskie was going to say so he could say the stuff he liked that Muskie might say before Muskie could say it. Then they started doing some real crazy stuff, like they kept stealing Ed Muskie's shoes. I'm not joking, look it up. They kept stealing Muskie's shoes. This little spy, the people he had inside the Muskie campaign would take the guy's shoes and just hide them. And they kept doing it and kept doing it and kept doing it. Muskie kind of lost a little bit of his mind, which helped McGovern end up winning the nomination. Okay, Nixon wanted to run against McGovern. He thought he could beat McGovern. He thought he'd have a harder time with Muskie, so he messed with Muskie until Muskie dropped out. George Wallace, running for a second time, gets shot shortly before the election, and he'll be paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. Much later on, Wallace will eventually repent for all of the racist stuff he had done in the past, which is sweet, I suppose, that he eventually grows into a better person. But he was a real bad person for a real long time, too. So take it with a grain of salt. Anyways, Nixon, to make sure that he wins the election, announces he had a peace deal with North Vietnam less than 2 weeks before the election. Was the peace deal actually in place? Nah, it's all very up in the air. Okay, but that ensures he'll win the election, plus running against someone like McGovern, who wasn't getting a lot of support from the party, ends up with a landslide, 520 to 17. Take a look at this. Not even close. Okay, not even close at all. Okay, McGovern wins one state and the District of Columbia. That's what he wins. Everything else goes to Nixon. Okay, no matter what, even if Nixon had run against Muskie, he probably would have won He was very popular for some of his foreign policy, but it was an absolute blowout. Also featured on there, we have a party here in America, the Libertarian Party, which isn't very popular or powerful, but it was the first time they ran somebody. So we actually had 4 different parties running in this election, but the Republicans win. This leads us all to Watergate. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop this video, so it'll be a 2-parter. So the first is Nixon up to Watergate, and then the second part will be all of the Watergate stuff, which leads to the end of the Nixon administration. So, quick pause, and I'll be right back.